Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit about how to obtain customer insights. Let's start by talking about why customer insights are so absolutely essential in business. And for that, let's take an analogy to make my point, hopefully. Right? Let's say that you want to cook a live frog, right? She's very cute. I don't know why anybody would want to do that to her, but anyway, imagine that you want to do that, right? So one thing that might happen is if you just create the situation for that, you might think, geez, maybe I can put a big pot of hot water and just drop the frog in. That's what they do with lobsters anyway, right? And if you try that, probably what will happen is the frog will just jump up, right? She will get burned, or he will get burned, right? And it will get burned, I guess, right? But it probably will make it, right? And they're agile, fast. So if you want to cook a frog that it's alive, the strategy that I will use will be different, right? I will put the frog in room temperature water, right, in a pot, and I will slowly turn up the heat, right? And what will happen over time is, the frog will just be around the water, all comfy. It will just start to get warm, but she'll just be doing whatever frogs do. I don't know what frogs do, right? And before you realize, you have a cooked frog, right? If you raise the temperature slow enough. Now, what is the point that I'm trying to make? If the environment of the frog is changing slowly, the frog might not notice that her livelihood is in danger, right? And the same is true for businesses, right? If the environment is changing slowly, you might not notice that you need to move your strategy, that you need to change the way you do things. You need to modify your practices because things are similar than they were before, and maybe there is not a main reason for us to change. When change is drastic and dramatic in your environment, when suddenly your customers go away or the technology totally changes, or the environment in which you do business has new laws and new restrictions like we're seeing right now because of the pandemic. In a situation like that, businesses are going to change and evolve. Otherwise, they're just going to go out of business, but they're going to have a good incentive to do that because they're going to notice that change in the environment and they're going to react to it. On the other hand, if change happens slowly, there's a good chance that you'll end up like the frog, right? And if you look at very successful businesses that are now actually not doing very well, maybe like Sears or JCPenney, they used to be giants in the industry that are now filing for bankruptcy or considering just closing altogether. And they are where they are because their environment changed little by little and they didn't adapt, right? So how do we avoid this problem? Well, the answer is we need to scan. We need to have our ears open, and I guess maybe we should buy a thermometer, right? And what I mean by this is we need to be really paying attention to what's happening in the environment and have the tools and the willingness to actually look for changes and try to think about what's the best strategy to deal with those changes once that we identify them. We won't notice the changes if we're not looking, so you better be looking for them. Right? So today we're going to talk about what are the key topics and key tools that you're going to use within a company to notice this information that is around you that is relevant, and hopefully how you translate that information into insights that will enable you to do better and thrive within the environment. So let's start by talking about the distinction between data, information, and insights. I think that is a very important distinction, right? Data is just facts, a collection of facts. They can be numeric or non-numeric, right? The text in this slide, for example, is data, right? The pixels in that image that you have in your right with those Pepsi bottles is also data, right? Data, 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 data. So data in many ways is objective, but also is devoid of meaning per se, right? And data is just facts, right? And facts are not very useful unless you put them together with other facts or other things that you already know to be true. So information is when we give meaning to those facts, whether they are numeric or textual or images or videos, I don't care, it doesn't matter, right? So the classic example of that distinction is the Apple and Newtonian physics, right? The story goes, and I'm not sure it's true or not, that when Newton was sitting or maybe taking a nap, we don't know, right, by a tree, suddenly an apple fell either, I don't know, from his head, but, let's just say around where he was, right? And suddenly, he had the aha moment, right? The fact was the fact that the apple was falling. How many millions of other people have seen apples fall before? A really large amount. None of them derive the same information from the data of the apple falling, right? So you need to understand the difference between data and information. Information is data that is put in context and made sense of based on whatever you already know to be true in the world, right? So Isaac Newton, saw the apple fall and understood that there was a force and called gravity that was pulling that apple down to the ground, right? That's something that many other people have seen but never have put those facts together in a way that made sense of the world, right? That is a very important distinction. Data is all around us. In fact, nowadays we have more data than ever before, right? There are gazillion bytes of data that are generated all the time through your phone, computer, everything that we do in life. There are cameras everywhere, sensors, right? We have lots of data, right? But data per se doesn't do much for you unless you convert it into information. What is information? It's data plus some sort of explanation of what's happening in that data, understanding patterns, looking at how it relates to reality, etc., etc. And then you have the next level, from data to information to insight. What is an insight? An insight is a fresh understanding of something that happens in the world that you can use to your advantage, right? So we're going to be talking mostly about consumer insights because, like I've mentioned, I think in chapter 1, and hopefully it should be clear right now, the central pillar of marketing is the consumer. You want to really understand your consumer so that you can provide that value for them. And the way you're going to do that is by having a fresh understanding of the information and all the issues surrounding the consumer, right? So again, what is data? Data are just facts. What is information? Information is data plus other data and or other things that you know about the world that give meaning to that data, okay? It's the aha moment. And an insight is a type of information that enables you to create value that was not there before. Let's talk about companies that are built on simple yet profound insights. And think about companies like Home Depot, right? Home Depot, and when I say Home Depot, Lowe's in a similar situation for obvious reasons, right? It's a company that was created with a simple insight, which is do-it-yourselfers, right? This was a segment that was clearly underserved, right? Traditional hardware stores were created and serving mostly professionals, right? And if you're a male, like me, right, we don't like to ask for directions. So this idea that you need to go to a store and admit that you don't know what it is that you want, because the traditional store format is that you will get there and there will be somebody at the counter and you will tell them what they want and they will go and get it for you. That doesn't blend really well with the typical way males solve problems. Okay. So the insight for Home Depot is do-it-yourselfers need tools and equipment to do home improvement, right? It's not only about the professionals. It's about a large chunk of the population that is being underserved. That simple customer insight build an empire, right? A multi-billion-dollar company. So you need to realize that when I'm talking about an insight, it's something that was there all along, but it took somebody to understand that to a level that it's definitely not obvious, and it's looking at it from a new perspective. What can I do differently? Another example of an insight will be Walmart, right? If you look at Walmart, historically, this was when Sears, by the way, was and Nordstrom. They were the best example in the industry, in the retail industry, of successful firms. Both Sears and Nordstrom were located in the middle of the cities, right? And the logic with that was that, you will put the stores where the density of customers was, so they can actually go and buy your product, because people didn't like to go far away from where they lived, right? And Sam Walton's insight was, well, we are building, this was a long time ago, we are building these really nice interstate highways. This is when the interstate highway system was being built. And now that we're going to have these really nice roads, people are going to be willing to go out of their comfort zone, meaning out of their usual region where they live or work. If the store that I create, it's going to be unique in some way. And in his way, it was basically about making goods affordable, right? So if it's affordable enough, if I put it in a location where maybe there is nobody now, but there is good access because there are highways, people will come. By the way, people used to make fun of him, and they thought that was honestly a stupid strategy. Look who's laughing now, right? But that simple insight build another empire, right? So you need to understand that customer insights are rare and extremely powerful. So if you can actually get there in any way, you're way ahead of the game. So this is what we're going to try to talk about in this lecture. Like I've already mentioned, what is an insight? It's a fresh and penetrating view of the obvious, right? This is the definition that Mohan Sani at Northwestern usually gives about an insight, right? So it's a fresh, meaning nobody else has thought about it this way. So it's kind of like a new perspective. Okay, and a penetrating view means just putting those facts together that I was mentioning and giving them meaning based on context, right? Really understanding what is happening, what is driving those needs and motives for the customers. Oftentimes those motives, the reason why people do things, it's not always obvious, right? There is a lot of latent motivation. In fact, if you listen to some behavioral economists, they will tell you that a lot of people don't know the reason why they do things. They just do things and then they come up with reasons after the fact, right? So trying to really understand the reason why people are doing things is not a trivial issue, right? So you need to get to somehow understand the process by which they are making those choices and what are the pain points. If you can solve those, you're going to be able to come up with better products, better services, better ways of satisfying those customers, and you're going to win in the marketplace. Now, how are we going to manage all this information and all these insights that we're trying to generate? By the way, before you can get to insights, you need to at least start with information, right? And to get to information, you need to get data. So what are you going to be doing systematically in the firm to make sure that you're scanning the environment, like I talked about last chapter, okay? So that you can really understand what's happening with all the different aspects that are important in the environment. Customers, I would say the central pillar, but also what is your competition up to, right? And what are your partners doing? Yeah. And what other geopolitical aspects you need to keep an eye on, the economy, culture, etc., right? So how are we going to make sure that we have relevant and current information about all these aspects? Well, we're going to have to come up with a systematic way of doing this, right? So we're going to have to come up with basically some sort of system that enables us to collect information, and we're going to have to be on top of it, right? So we're going to be managing this information system or information process. So the way we're going to do it formally, we're going to call it marketing information system. And this is going to be both the people and the processes that you actually set in place to make sure that you have relevant and timely information that is going to enable you to make better decisions, better marketing decisions, because this is what we're talking about. But I guess you could have the same thing for other aspects of the firm. And to make sure that you're able to provide that value to the customers. And to do that, what you're going to have to do is make sure that you have good data, that you turn that good data into good information, and hopefully out of that information, every once in a while, you come up with some good market insights. So this is conceptually how the system is going to work. Of course, the specifics are going to be firm and industry dependent. Right? But when you look at it from the perspective of how to set up the marketing information system, it's going to look like this, right? So let me highlight some of the aspects that you have here. Right? So we're going to have first the users, right, of the system. And these are going to be mostly, in our case, marketing executives, right? Marketing managers that have to make decisions about pricing, products, promotion, all the tactical aspects that we have discussed, right? But before we can actually make those decisions, we need to have information about the environment. Right? So these people that are going to be interfacing with the information system are going to have certain information needs, right? And getting actually to know exactly what it is that somebody is looking for, it might actually require its own process, right? So you might have to actually interview some of these managers and make sure that you understand what it is that they are trying to get at, right? What kind of information will be actually useful for them, right? So you're going to have some information needs, and that are from the user, right? And the executive or executives that are trying to make decisions about marketing. Then what you're going to do is you're going to create the information system itself. This is basically where you actually have the different buckets of information. We're going to make a distinction between three very different types of information. We're going to talk about databases, right? And these are essentially, now there will be computer files or computer files plus whatever specific software enables you to have access to the files. It could be servers, etc., and networks. Originally, these used to be literally files and pieces of paper, right? You literally had your data in databases, and these were literally notations, right? But that's a long time ago, right? Now everything is going to be probably either a relational database or a non-relational database. And I'm not going to get into the technical details. I think everybody knows what a database is. But if you don't have any idea, let me just briefly describe. I'm assuming you know what an Excel spreadsheet is. And you can think about a database as essentially a spreadsheet that is connected with other spreadsheets and enables you to access the information that is from one to the other. Okay, that's a very crude and simplistic perspective. Now, what kind of information you're going to have in these databases? Things like customer records. Like every time a customer puts on an order, you're going to know the date, who bought it, how did they pay for it, and how much and what did they buy, right? That will be something that is recorded in the firm that you can actually leverage for information later, right? It will be very useful for a salesperson, for example, to know, and depending on who you are talking about, what kind of orders do they put, how frequently do they buy, etc., etc., etc. All that information is going to be in internal databases of the firm. Okay. Then you're going to have marketing intelligence. This is usually information that you collect using secondary sources. What do I mean by this? Well, this might be information that you're collecting, for example, from competitors from their annual reports, right? So this is not data that you are generating specifically for anything. You just happen to have found that data because maybe you were looking for it, right? So that's marketing intelligence. And then you're going to have market research. This is data that you're going to collect yourself or maybe hire a company to collect it for you because it's maybe not publicly available, okay? So if you want to know certain things, you're going to have to find them out yourselves. So if you want to know something about your customers, maybe you need to do a survey, one experiment. We're going to talk about different ways in which you can do market research. Okay, so you're going to have these three big buckets of information. Okay, and you're going to have to look at that information and come up with some sort of analysis, right? Oftentimes, the analysis, it sounds fancy. It might be just a summary of the data, right? Like a computer mean. If you have a lot of observations so that you can tell people where things are more or less, right? It doesn't have to be fancy. It could be fancy. Depends on the question that you're going to start with. Okay. And all this data is going to be from the environment that is pertinent and relevant to us, which we have already talked about in the previous chapter. The microenvironment, which is going to be mostly your customers, your competitors, the firm itself, and your collaborators. And then you're going to have the macroenvironment, the economy, social changes, political changes, demographic changes. We have already discussed all that. And this is the whole information system that you're going to have. Now, from the three big buckets of information that I was talking about before, so you have internal databases and marketing intelligence. The one that is a little bit more complex and that I want to spend some more time talking about is going to be marketing research. Now, marketing research on its own, it's a whole discipline, right? And there are many institutions that will offer a class, right? Marketing research. So this is a really deep topic, right? Today we're going to just scratch the surface, talk a little bit about the process on how to collect your own information for marketing decisions. And also I'm going to talk about a little bit of the type of techniques that you will use within market research to collect this data. So let's talk first process, and then I'll talk about more of the details. And the way you're going to be collecting your own data, it's going to start with the problem definition. And I can't emphasize how important this step is that you might take for granted in the beginning, which is exactly what kind of information are you looking for. And this is going to be related to what kind of business decision are you trying to make, right? So if the business decision is, hey, it seems like our sales are down, right? We want to try to understand why our sales are down. There is no clear decision, at least at this point. When it comes down to that, you're kind of in exploratory mode, and you need to understand that, right? So to define the problem, it needs to be defined clearly up front to make sure that whatever you get out of the project, in this case of a market research project, is actually going to address the problem that you're trying to set up, right? If you set up the wrong problem definition from the beginning, whatever outcome comes out of it, no matter how expensive the project is, no matter how good of a job you do, if the definition of the problem is wrong, you're going to have a beautiful answer for the wrong thing, which is not very useful, right? So first thing you need to do is really understand what the problem that is trying to be tackled is. And for that, oftentimes, what you'll have to do is you'll have to talk to the decision makers, right? So the marketing executives that are going to make a call and the ones that are sponsoring this particular project, what is they're trying to get at. And this might actually take multiple meetings or conversations before you can actually nail it down. Okay. In fact, you might need to do your own mini research topic before you can just define the problem itself. So first exploratory technique that will enable you to define the problem, and after the problem is defined, then maybe you can see what kind of information you need to find solutions to that problem. Then after you have defined the research question, then what you're going to do is you're going to basically come up with a research plan that is going to clearly outline what kind of information you're going to get to basically solve that problem that you have set up from, or problems if there is multiple research questions, which is often the case. Okay, what kind of data is needed, and how is that data going to be acquired, right? What kind of tools are you going to use to acquire the data? We're going to talk a little bit about the basic tools that are used for data collection. Okay, and after that information is collected, what you're going to do is you're going to implement the plan, and that's going to involve both the collection of the information and then the analysis of it, right? So you need to make sure that after you get the data, you provide some meaning to the data. Remember, the difference between data is information. It has meaning associated because you're making sense of the data by combining it, by looking at patterns, or by adding it to other data that you already have or knowledge of the world, right? So usually it requires an expert that's going to help you understand and make sense of the data, okay? Especially if you're doing any fancy analytical technique, which you may or you may not. It depends. Most market research, in my experience, uses simple analytics, but it depends, right? And finally, what you're going to do is you're going to take that information that comes out of the report and you're going to present that to the executives to see, if it can help them make a better decision. Okay, good. Now, what kind of tools are you going to use for gathering information? Well, it depends what it is that you're trying to do, right? So your objective, it's going to oftentimes dictate the techniques that are used. Okay, what do I mean by this? Well, we're going to make a distinction between three different types of data collections. We're going to talk about exploratory research, we're going to talk about descriptive research, and we're going to talk about causal research. My apologies. Okay, so let's start with exploratory. Exploratory is when you really don't have a very clear idea of what's happening, right? I think I already alluded to a typical situation, right? Your sales are down, you don't know why. You're trying to find out, right? So in a situation like this, oftentimes the kind of data collection methods that are used are very broad, and oftentimes they are non-numeric, right? So when you're having exploratory research done, oftentimes you'll use things like interviews. You'll just talk to, for example, you might interview customers, right? That will be useful to see why it is that they are not buying, or they are buying less than they were buying before. Salespeople, right? Maybe some of your competitors, although that might be harder to arrange, right? But oftentimes the techniques that you're going to use, they're just trying to understand what's happening. They don't have a clear hypothesis about what's going on. And because of that very nature, oftentimes they are not even numerical. They tend to be qualitative in nature. Okay. Then you have descriptive research, right? That's number two. Now, descriptive research, it's usually done when you're trying to get a picture of what's happening in a situation, right? So, for example, you might want to know whether your customers are satisfied or not, and to what extent, right? And that's something that a descriptive research will address very successfully. Right? And this, as you can see, it tends to be more quantitative, but it doesn't have to be. It could also be qualitative. You could address this also using interviews, like I've said before, like having one-on-one in-depth interviews with with customers, okay? Or you could use a survey. By the way, survey is a tool that is the most heavily used in market research, right? So for a lot of these issues, right, you will just go and ask the customers, right? That will be descriptive. Then what do you do with those answers is you summarize them, and boom, your average satisfaction score is 4.2 out of 5, right? And I don't know what that means, because you will have to interpret it by looking historically what it used to be, how it compares to your competitors, etc. But that's just descriptive research. And then finally, you have causal research. Now, this is a very different animal. Okay? Causal research is when you're trying to understand what are the reasons why things are changing. Okay? It's the understanding of causes and effects. And effects is what we're interested in for the most part in causal research. An effect is something that does something to something else. Let me give you an example. Typical causal research question will be, if I increase my advertising by $1 million, what will happen to my sales? Right. So you're trying to find an effect, right, by how much one thing changes when something else is changing. That is a hypothetical question. We don't know what is going to happen, right? And to address causal research, typically you will use experiments. Now let me explain to you why you will use experiments. The reason why is because proving causality is difficult, okay? And there are three things that you need to check to make sure that you can say that something is causing something else. And hence the effect, for example, of advertising and sales is indeed because advertising and not because, I don't know, one of your competitors, for example, dropped out, right? So, three conditions for causality. Number one, okay, covariation. What do I mean by this? Covariation, concomitant covariation. That means that the two things that you're measuring need to move together. Now, I'm going to leave it at that instead of just telling you correlation, which is what most people will tell you. Because correlation, it implies that the relationship between the two variables is linear. And that's not necessary for causation, okay? It could be a nonlinear relationship, but that's technical and it's not that important. Let's just say things need to move together. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you plot, if you have here your advertising and here you have your sales and you plot them and you see a plot like this where it looks like it's trending up, right? It looks like the more you advertise in this case, the higher your sales are. So because of that, we fulfill the first condition, which is that they move together. Okay, those two variables move together. We're trying to see whether advertising is causing sales, right? Number two, you have temporal aspects, right? What do I mean by this? Well, for something to cause something else, that something, in this case advertising, needs to move first. So you need to make sure that advertising increased, and then after it increased, sales went up. Not the other way around, not that first sales went up and then advertising followed, right? And so that's what I mean by temporal aspects. You need to be able to check that the variable that you're seeing, whether it's causing something else, indeed move first. Okay. This oftentimes requires for you as a researcher to basically manipulate or change that variable. And this is why we're going to use experiments oftentimes. Okay. And number three, and this is the most difficult of all three by a lot, is you need to rule out all other explanations. Okay. So explanations. What do I mean by explanations? Well, if I see that sales are going up, is it because maybe my competitors are getting out of business? And yeah, I'm spending more money in advertising, but that's really not doing anything, right? So if there are any other explanations that will basically show you a pattern like the one you're observing in the data, in this case, a simplistic increase in my sales, like you can see right here. If there are other things that can explain that are not advertising, right, then I cannot rule out that something else is not the reason why it's happening, and because of that I cannot prove causality. This, ruling out all other alternative explanations, is so difficult to do that what we usually do is we run experiments where we try to hold everything else constant and just do a little change and see what happens. That's what an experiment is. Want to learn about this, you can do experimental design. It's a whole branch of statistics and mathematics, and it's a complex issue. I'm not going to address in class at all. Good. Now, once that we understand what our objective is, and because of that, it's going to dictate mostly what kind of techniques we're going to use, at least what kind of research we're going to do, whether it's going to be exploratory, descriptive, or causal, which is very important. Then what we're going to do is we're going to come up with a plan on how we're going to collect that data. Okay, and that's going to dictate everything from what tools we use. When I was explaining the objectives, I mentioned that, if you do exploratory research, maybe I can do an in-depth interview, right? So that's a tool they use to gather information, right? And so you need to outline in your plan exactly what tools you're going to use to gather that information. Not only what tools you're going to use, but exactly what questions you're going to ask if you're doing an in-depth interview. That's going to be the questionnaire that you're actually going to use. Also, what sample are you going to use, or sampling method, to decide who is going to be actually answering those questions, right? So you're usually not going to ask everybody, right? So if you have 10 million potential customers, you're not going to ask all 10 million. You're just going to sample a few. And the question is, which ones are you going to sample, right? And there are techniques that are used for that, right? Maybe we'll talk a little bit about sampling. And then instruments to gather data, which is, like I said, in the case of in-depth interviews, it will be a questionnaire. If you're doing observational techniques, right, you're observing customers and see what they do, then maybe you just take notes, right? Or you might use sensors, right, like store counters. If you want to know how many customers, what store traffic is at different times, right? So it depends on what it is that you're trying to tackle. You're going to use different tools and instruments to gather that data. When you're creating your research plan, the first thing you're going to do is, again, start with the managerial problem, right? This might require multiple meetings with management to flesh out exactly what it is that they are trying to address. Okay. From here, you're going to create what are the research objectives and type of research that you're going to use. I've already described the 3 broad types. Okay. Then you're going to come up with a document that actually has specific information needs based on this managerial problem that you have defined and research objectives. Okay. And then after this, what you're going to do is you're going to do a what if scenario, where if I give you the answers to these questions that we have outlined, what kind of decisions, or how will this help you with decision making? And by the way, if the answer is, if you give me that kind of data, regardless of what the data is, we will make the same decision regardless, then obviously you need to stop and not do any market research. You've already made your own decision, right? By the way, oftentimes managers sponsor a marketing research program or plan just because they are trying to justify the decision that they have already made, and the only thing that they're trying to do is they're trying to have a nice set of PowerPoint slides that they can use to show their boss why the decision they already made is the best decision. That's not the right way to do marketing research. You should be wondering what to do before you actually pay to do a market research, right? And finally, you're going to set up a budget, right? Marketing research is expensive because you're collecting your own data, unlike marketing intelligence, which tends to be a lot more inexpensive. By the way, if you can address your issues with secondary data that you can collect easily, then you don't need to do marketing research. In fact, let's talk more about that in the next slide. So let me make a clear distinction between secondary and primary data, which I haven't done, although I've alluded to it in a couple of the slides. Secondary data is information that has been collected for some other purpose. Other purpose than what? Other purpose than the decision that you're trying to make right now. Okay. So if you conducted a marketing research study to check what the satisfaction of your customers is because you're trying to do, I don't know, like a rewards program, for example. Fine, you already have that data, so you know what the levels of satisfaction are. Let's say that you've been tracking your customer satisfaction over multiple years. So you have that data already internally. Now, if you decide to look at your satisfaction data because you are thinking about implementing a new pricing policy, for example, even though you collected the data yourself, okay, so this was done internally, because the data was collected for a different purpose, if you use that satisfaction data to do the pricing decision, now suddenly it becomes secondary data. So secondary or primary data, it's only a function of why was that data collected. If you get the data from somebody else, by definition, it means it's secondary. And the reason why is because they collected it for a different purpose. Unless, I guess, if you hire that third party to collect the data for you for this purpose, and then it's primary data, right? So it's all about why the data is collected. Now, I'm assuming that this will be obvious, but just in case. Secondary data kind of has a bad rep to it, and it shouldn't have it, right? It has some really good things to it. So let's talk about what's good about secondary data. And the most important things, I will say, is the first two, right? And number one is cheap. In fact, some of this data might be free, but free other than the time it takes you to actually go and get it, right? So for example, the government provides a lot of statistics that are very useful, like the census, for example, and it's publicly available. So you can actually go and gather information about the census. If you're using demographics in your targeting or segmentation, a lot of this data is already available for you for free. So that will be secondary data for you, okay? And then the second, and maybe the best thing of all, is that you can get it quickly, right? Doing a marketing research study not only is expensive, but also it takes time to do, right? So having the data already, because it's already published, right? It's great. And now, what are the issues with secondary data? Well, there could be a few issues. The most important is relevance, Oftentimes what you're going to have to do with secondary data is you're going to have to settle, right? So maybe you want to learn about the willingness to pay of people, and maybe you cannot have access to that data. You will have to create a questionnaire that asks people specifically about that. But maybe you can substitute that with some other information that tells you a little bit about willingness to pay, but it's not exactly willingness to pay. Like maybe you can gather information about income, or even better, disposable income. And that might already have been done for you. So you can have access to that data, secondary data, right? For example, of disposable income. And yes, that's not the same as willingness to pay for something, but it will probably correlate. So people that have more disposable income probably willing to pay more for a product than people that have lower disposable income, right? And so long as that's true, it's going to be a helpful proxy. It's not the best information, so it might not be 100% relevant because you're using a substitute, but it's better than nothing, especially if you cannot collect the information otherwise, right? Accuracy, this is harder to ascertain because if it's secondary data, you may not have collected it yourself, although if you're collected yourself, you know exactly the methods and techniques that have been used. So you might know that the accuracy is fine. This is more a question mark than it's not accurate. It's just not true. Okay, the relevancy is more of the issue. Okay, currency, it's a problem time, right? Because the fact that it's secondary usually tends to mean that it's in the past. The question is how far in the past. If it's only a month, maybe not a big deal, or it could be a lot, a month, depending on how fast things are changing, right? And then partiality, this depends on the data collection methods used and who collected the data and where the data comes from. Some sources are great. Usually government data tends to be fairly reliable, at least from the US and other developed countries. It might not be the case in things like China, right? We've seen what happened with COVID-19 and impartiality of the data.